Should we be testing acid as a new treatment for autism? So here is the actual science behind this and the weird history. So this is not a brand new idea. In fact, people have been doing this since like the late 50s through the 70s. And when I say doing this, I mean doing genuinely terrible scientific research to determine if acid can be used to treat autism spectrum disorder. Now, here's a little bit of information that you need to know before going into the current history. So we used to think that autism spectrum disorder was actually basically like the childhood version of schizophrenia. And it's important to note that at the time that the studies were being done, acid did not have the stigma that it does have today. Now, these studies, as I mentioned, were genuinely wild. So, for example, the first formal study that was done on this is a study in which they gave children between the ages of 5 and 11 acid before going to school, and then they just kind of observed their effects. They didn't have like formal measurements for the symptoms. They didn't have formal measurements for things like physiological measures. They just kind of gave them drugs and then looked at them. And they did not find great results. So they found that children were not eating. They were not actually typically doing much of anything. In some cases, they were just kind of staring at objects for hours upon hours. And in the most important thing, it didn't actually make these children verbal. So most of these children were nonverbal, and the scientists honestly thought that giving them acid would make them like start talking, and it didn't. Now, most of these studies did not actually go the way that the scientists wanted them to. So they wanted to see if acid would actually help with autism spectrum disorder, and in most cases, it did not. And even though they were not getting great results, they still kept testing them. So they kept saying things like, oh yeah, children respond differently to acid than adults, so it doesn't really matter if we test in this population, like they're fine. They don't have terrible side effects, and they can take even higher doses than adults can. Which, where they got these ideas, I have genuinely no clue. It is not from the science. And then there are even more disturbing points in these OG studies. So, for example, one scientist said that they were being, quote, extremely cautious. They even asked for parental consent. They even asked for parental consent as though that was not a thing that they were doing in the rest of these studies. Who was giving these children drugs, and why were their parents not informed of this? Now, you may be horrified by these studies, but we have had a long and sordid history, including into recent times, of people doing genuinely terrible things to try to treat children with autism spectrum disorder, and adults. Let's be clear, it is both kids and adults. So there are all sorts of therapies like bleach therapy or testosterone inhibitors. They try to limit the amount of testosterone. And even sketchy therapy methods like holding therapy, where you're just physically restraining children to make them bond with their caregivers again, as though the only problem with autism is a lack of attachment. Y'all, our stigma against autism and our genuinely frantic search to try to treat it is disturbing. But now scientists are trying to actually resurrect this idea of acid for autism because there's some science that suggests that it might work. Now we're trying to do this appropriately. So we're not just giving high doses because supposedly children can handle it. We're trying to come up with appropriate placebos, which is very difficult for studies on acid. And we're not doing things like giving a child acid every single day for 18 months, which was one of the original studies. So what have we found out that makes us want to start trying this again? Well, first, we do see that things like acid actually improve some of the symptoms that people have with autism spectrum disorder. So one of the major ones is things like social communication. We see that acid improves social behavior. It does things like increase empathy. It makes people want to be closer to one another. And we've seen this in both like rats, but also in human work. Rat empathy is a thing I will talk about forever. We also see that acid might reduce some of the other symptoms that people with autism spectrum disorder might have. For example, things like anxiety and depression. In some cases, a couple doses of acid can improve symptoms of things like anxiety for up to a year afterwards. More recent studies suggest that acid might actually help with things like cognitive flexibility too. So what we see is that in some people with autism spectrum disorder, there's kind of this inability to think or adapt to situations. Instead, you're kind of in like these rigid, specific terms like black or white thinking. And something like acid might actually improve cognitive flexibility, so kind of make people more adaptable. And then there's this weird relationship with masking. So masking is like a type of camouflage in people with autism spectrum disorder. It's seen with other disorders as well, where it's basically like a way to not appear as though you have that disorder when you're interacting with other people. So typically masking is linked with things like negative outcomes. So you typically kind of have worse emotional and mental health if you mask a lot. But what people said with autism spectrum disorder when they were on acid, they said that acid made masking like more natural for people. So they were still doing it, but they didn't really feel uncomfortable with the premise of doing it. which could potentially make things better. We're not entirely sure. Now, how is acid actually working to treat autism spectrum disorder? We're not entirely sure. There's a suggestion that it might improve things like neuroplasticity, which might improve symptoms. There's a suggestion that there's just too little serotonin in patients with autism spectrum disorder. And since acid works to increase serotonin, it might be kind of helping with that. And we do see that there are differences in kind of the ability to produce serotonin, like the capacity of serotonin production in children with autism spectrum disorder. So there might be something there. We just don't have the good science on it yet. Like the latest study that we have looking at autism spectrum disorder and acid is a self-report questionnaire where they just ask people online, like, hey, have you done a psychedelic? And did that produce any sort of like life-altering experience? And if so, could you tell me what happened? And so in this study, there were like 233 people. A little more than half of them had been actually diagnosed by a professional. And then the other little bit, so a little over 40% were actually self-diagnosed. Then they were asked, like, what drug did you have this quote, like life-altering experience on? And about half of them said it was acid. And so then they basically asked them, hey, when you took acid, what changed? So there was a small group that said, yeah, they took acid and it had a life-changing experience, but in a negative way. Like it just produced aversive effects, made them more anxious long-term. Then there is also a large group of people who said that it did help. Like it produced these mystical experiences, and that was linked to kind of like more positive reports and a decrease of things like autism spectrum disorder symptoms. And there are like weird findings, like it increased the feeling of loneliness, but it seems like it increased the ability for someone to recognize that they were lonely. So they were like then more likely to go out and seek social support because they recognized that they were feeling lonely. But again, this is all self-report where they just basically found people online who had done drugs and also had been diagnosed either by a professional or just by themselves with autism spectrum disorder, and they asked them about these things. So we don't have this good hardcore research that says that acid is doing anything for autism spectrum disorder. So is this something that science should be looking into? I don't know. This is up for debate. So the past history suggests that, like, no, there's not really anything there, but that was some terrible science. This is a good time for us to start collecting more anecdotes, for us to start thinking about how to properly run these studies, and for us to seriously consider the ethics of doing this research.